Hey folks, welcome to another Passion for Sound audio review. Today, thanks once again to channel patron Jeff, who was responsible for the recent Shit Magni Heresy review. I'm now reviewing the Sennheiser HD58X, also on loan from Jeff. Now the 58X will be familiar to many of you. It's essentially an entry-level option to get into the realm of things like the HD650 and the HD600 from Sennheiser, and it's available through drop for about $170 US, or about 240 Australian dollars. So at that price, it has some stiff competition in the form of things like Beyerdynamics DT880s that I reviewed here recently, and even compared to the 58X. So my question for this review is the 58X the best entry-level budget audiophile headphone? Let's dive in and find out. Let's jump straight into the design of the 58X. They're a very similar design, in fact an identical design to the 600s and 650s, in that they've got the spring steel headband covered in plastic with some nice padding underneath, and then you've got these oval shaped ear cups with these soft velour pads. So it's very familiar territory for anybody that's used to the 600s or 650s. In fact, these are built on the original designs that led to the HD 600 and 650, so there's no coincidence about the similarity. According to the information on drop, the drivers in these are different from the 600 and 650, but they're still tuned with a similarity in mind. My first impression of the build quality on these, particularly coming from the 880s that I've just reviewed recently, is that they feel a bit plasticky compared to something like the 880s. They have a slightly cheaper look and feel to them. They're nice and light, which is good, but the plastickiness is just a little bit off-putting for me. You've got touches of metal in the spring steel headband and also in the grills here. I believe they're metal, although it's hard to say by feel, but pretty much everything else feels like plastic, and that's a bit of a shame, given that there are other products out there on the market that manage to make the plastics feel better or use metal instead. One thing that's great about the design of the 58X is they've got twin cable entries on the bottom here. So it means they can be driven balanced if that's important to you, and you can actually buy the balanced 2.5mm cable for just $5 US extra when you buy these on drop. So it's a good versatile design in that you can change cables and you can adjust it to suit what you're going to be driving it with in terms of amplification. The cable that comes with it as standard is a very simple 3.5mm cable. As you can see here, 3.5mm termination, and it's got the Sennheiser double pin connectors here. So one drawback with this design is you do have to get specially made cables for any of the Sennheiser HD 600, 650, 58X series. If you do want to upgrade and play with cables, you're not going to be able to swap in and out other manufacturers' cables like you can with something that uses a 2.5 or a 3.5mm simple headphone style socket in the headphone. So this is a slight drawback, but the cable's nice, it's decent quality, it feels good, and it works well. The only other thing to talk about with the design is the fact that it's a 150 ohm headphone, but it's got quite high sensitivity at 104 decibels. So it's relatively easy to drive from most sources. You're not going to get the most out of it from something like a smartphone, but at the same time, if you're using any kind of external DAC like an AudioQuest Dragonfly or the Tempotec Sonata that I've got coming up for review shortly, technically the HD Pro is what I've got coming up for review, any of these are going to actually drive the HD58X quite well. And then of course you can always scale up further by going to a full desktop type system like what's behind me here. One thing to keep in mind is that whilst these are rated at 150 ohms, they've actually got a spike that goes all the way up over 420 ohms at around about 65 hertz. So if you don't have a source that's got good power and the ability to drive that really high level of impedance, you may find yourself losing out a bit of the bass on these. So it's something to be aware of, but it's not something to put you off, because as I said, most of those external DAC devices, or indeed full desktop setups, most of those will have enough power to handle these okay. Now, comfort in these is an interesting thing. The wearing comfort I find a bit of a mixed bag. The padding's really nice on the headband and also the velour pads, but the clamping force is quite tight. Now with all of this style-up design headphone from Sennheiser, you can bend the steel band to loosen it off a little bit. I'm not going to do that because these don't belong to me, but it is possible and it can loosen the clamping force. So be aware of that if you do buy a pair of these and find them a little bit tight. Other than that, the padding's nice and soft, there's plenty of space for your ears, and it's a headphone that once on, if the clamping force is fixed and correct for you, they're very comfortable for long sessions, so no complaints there at all, but I do find something like the DT880s to be that little bit more comfortable. So let's talk now a bit about the sound from the 58X. Overall, I'd say they're just okay. They're good, I wouldn't say they're great. And that's taking their price into account. So I'm not comparing them with high-level flagships here. I'm comparing them with things like the DT880s that sit right alongside. And while the DT880s also aren't perfect, they, for me, provide better value in terms of an overall better balanced sound signature. Now specifically, the reason I'm saying that about the 58Xs is they've just got some imbalances in the signature, and a few areas they just fall a bit flat for me. If we start with the bass is quite good, but it lacks a little bit of weight down low, a little bit of texture, and the overall control is not as good as I'd like it to be. Now in terms of the texture for the bass, I think that's actually good enough for the price point. At $170 US, you're not expecting perfect sound quality in every possible way. So the texture's not bad, but I did want to point out that it's not as articulate as some other headphones in the bass region. I think the biggest issue in the bass for me is that it just lacks a little bit of oomph and presence down low, and that's particularly at the lower end of the register where the bass does start to roll off a bit. Overall though, the bass part of the frequency range of the 58X is nicely balanced with the rest of the headphones, so that to me is not where the issues lie. It's not perfect, but at $170 US, I'm not expecting it to be. So that's good enough, and the problems actually lie elsewhere in the sound signature, and specifically it lies in the mid-range. So the mids from the 58X are kind of its party piece in a way. So like the 600 and the 650 that have both kind of built their reputations on mid-range quality, the 58X is tuned to have a very similar sound to those. And in many ways it works. There's a nice richness, there's a good sense of body to the sound, and general clarity in the mids is really strong. So the drawback for me is that there's a little bit of air missing, and when I say air, there's a sense of the little bit of detail, a little bit of texture missing from the mids, and it just prevents the headphone from overall sounding as natural as I'd like it to. It's one of those things that tends to present itself on certain tracks more than others, so on one track the 58X would sound fantastic, on another track I'd feel like there was just something missing and it wasn't quite right. And I'll explain how I discovered exactly what the problem was in just a moment, because it's also how you can fix the 58X without doing a single modification to the headphone itself. Before I talk about that though, let's quickly jump to the treble, because there's some stuff going on there that I'm not a fan of. Again, at the price point, it's not a problem, but for me it's just not quite as good as some of the other options on the market. So the treble overall is quite nice, it's fairly well presented, but it's got a slight edginess to it. It's got a slight harshness that I can only put down to there maybe being a bit of distortion or something somewhere in the sound frequency, or a peak in the frequency response that's causing something just to stick out more than it should and get in the way of the rest of the sound signature. And that's a little bit strange because overall the 58X isn't a bright sounding headphone. It's relatively mellow in the treble, but the qualities and the timbre of the treble are just not quite on the mark for me. Again, my reference point for a lot of this comes back to the DT880, and while that's also not a perfect headphone, I felt like it did each frequency a little bit better across the board than the 58X, with perhaps the exception of the mid-range not having quite that liquid, rich feel, but at the same time it was a better balanced mid-range in terms of not having that hole that leaves you feeling like you're missing some texture or some air in the recording. Before I continue on, I just want to give you some exciting news that Passion for Sound now has merchandise. So far I've got one design, but there's a couple more on the way, and they're available on a wide range of t-shirts, hoodies, and a few accessories as well. So if you like the look of this design and you can imagine yourself wearing it, I'll pop a link down below. You can jump on through and check out the options. Before I come back around and talk about what fixed the sound signature of the 58X, I just want to talk a little bit about the overall sound stage from them. And again, I'd describe it as good, okay, but not great. And that's because everything's kind of kept inside your head with the 58X. Nothing ever gets outside of it. It doesn't throw particularly wide or particularly deep in the soundstage. And so whilst things are well delineated within the soundstage, they all kind of sit in the same spot. So listening to orchestral pieces, for instance, you can hear each of the individual sections of the orchestra, but they sound like they're in a really tight space, all closely crammed in together. So it's not a great sound staging headphone. And a lot of that comes from that lack of air in the mid-range and extension in the treble, and it produces that slightly hazy sort of sound. And I hate using the word hazy because Sennheiser, there's this whole reputation of it being the veil and stuff like that. But for me, hazy was the word that I kept coming back to, and I compared it with something like the Focal Clear, which obviously is way, way, way more expensive and better a headphone, but at the same time it showed me what the music should have sounded like, and the 58X just sounded hazy was the best word I could use to describe it. So what did I do to fix it? The fix was actually really simple. With most headphones I review, I try to test them across a range of different amplifiers to see if there's anything striking about a certain pairing or a certain combination. And in this case, one of the things I tried with the 58X was using it with the bottle head mainline, using the high output impedance setting, and it was like a night and day difference. I've rarely heard such a dramatic shift in the sound quality of a headphone as I did with the high output impedance. So the moment I flicked over to the high output impedance, everything just opened up with the 58X, and it went from being a headphone that I describe as just okay to being really excellent. So it's one of those headphones where I'd say if you're using an OTL amplifier, something with high output impedance, these could be a real winner in that setup. But if you're using a low output impedance solid state amplifier, I think you're better off looking somewhere else for an entry level headphone. As an example, connecting the 58X up to something like the shit Magni Heresy that I just reviewed is fine, it's okay, but it's not great. Whereas the moment you go over to that high output impedance, it just comes alive. Now you don't have to buy a mainline to get that sort of performance. Something like the Bottlehead Crack is a very cheap and easy DIY kit that would drive the 58X to perfection. So there's plenty of options out there, and it's worth knowing that these headphones can excel if you've got the right amplification for them, and that means high output impedance, which is an unusual recommendation for most people to make, but in this case I think it rings true. One other comment I should make, and this is not about using high output impedance headphone amps, it's about every headphone amp I tried it with. Where the 58X does excel across the board is with things like jazz. So with instruments and vocals that are a bit lower in the mid-range register, so saxophones, male vocals and the like, they can sound really good through the 58X. One of the test tracks I was using was Flamenco Sketches by Miles Davis, and both saxophones on that recording came through really beautifully rendered by the 58X. They were rich, they were lush, and the texture was still there. So obviously the tonality of the saxophone suits the 58X, whereas a female vocal like Ella Fitzgerald from Clap Hands, Here Comes Charlie just was a little bit lacking for me. So that gives you an idea of where the 58X plays well and where it doesn't so much. So the conclusion for me, and in my opinion, the answer to the question of whether or not these are a good entry-level audiophile headphone would be to say not really, unless you're pairing them with an OTL or other high output impedance headphone amplifier. To my mind, there's just better options out there on the market for similar dollars that are going to perform better overall. The DT880 250 ohm being a great example. However, if what I've said about these piques your interest, I will pop a link down below so you can go through to drop and take a look at them for yourself. For now though, I just want to say another huge thank you to Jeff for making this review possible. I can now send the Heresy and the 58X back to you, Jeff, safe and sound. And for everyone else, if you appreciate Jeff making this possible, maybe drop a thanks to him down in the comments below. Until next time, happy listening, and I'll see you again soon on Passion for Sound.